all, thank you very much for having us. Glenn Bartelt, Pastor Harrison, and myself will be touching on the history of First Lutheran and some exciting events coming up. We started this plan in May of 2024, and we kicked it off with a big birthday party on June 7th for the 99th birthday celebration. We were pleased to have the first associate pastor at First Lutheran Church, Pastor Fier, preach that weekend. Before getting into the history of First Lutheran, I would like to share a memory that I have from my 71 years at First Lutheran Church. Growing up in the church always made the youth feel like they were just as important as any other part of the congregation. I was able to attend Luther League, which the church collected to help send as many students as wanted to go. It was held in New York City during my junior year of high school. To be in a convention hall with 10,000 youth all over the United States, hearing God's message and singing songs of praise will always remain in my heart. As a side note, I got in the elevator one morning and I met this tall guy in a suit, and he asked me if I liked baseball. And I said, yes, I'm a Chicago Cubs fan. It was Johnny Bench of the Cincinnati Reds. Oh my goodness. So, since the birthday party last June, we have had many exciting events. Each month we had a celebration where past pastors were invited to come back and preach for the weekend. We had celebrations for Camp Iwalu, the Lutheran camp that many youth attend, Lutheran World Relief, and a celebration of Jack Jones being our organist for 50 years. Our biggest event was a Pay It Forward campaign. The congregation was asked to donate $100 representing our 100 years as a congregation. We collected $10,550. The congregation then submitted organizations they would like to see be rewarded. We gave checks to a total of 18 local organizations. Now for the first important facts. On June 7th, there will be a music festival at the Onward Center. There will be a choir made up of members from past years, as well as our current choir at First Lutheran. Dr. Jack Broman will be the conductor, and his sisters will join us in song. The music festival starts at 3 and is at the Onward Center in Maquoketa. Then at 5 o'clock, we are going to have a social hour at Pearson Hall, with supper starting at 6 p.m., being served by Geronimo's. It is important that all reservations are made and paid for by May 19th. This can be done on the First Lutheran website, after church services on the weekends, and by calling the church office. Call soon for your reservations, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you. Since this is a county organization, I thought rather than limiting this strictly to First Lutheran, we might start with a history of Lutheran congregations in Jackson County. And so if you'll indulge me for a few minutes. This history is largely taken from the book History of Jackson County, 1989, published by the Jackson County Historical Society. And I've supplemented that with some additional sources that I'll try to refer to as we come to them. So in that book, each congregation in the county, not just Lutheran, but all of the congregations, were invited to submit their individual congregational history. And what I've done, I've read through those related to the Lutheran congregations and put it together in a narrative form, sort of in a story, following it in chronological order. The history of the Lutheran churches in the American Midwest is one of ethnic churches. German Lutheran immigrants came together to form German-speaking congregations, as did Lutheran immigrants from Norway, from Sweden, and from Denmark with their native languages. As far as I know, each of these put the word evangelical in their titles, but which means, of course, inviting and growth and so on. But it seems to me services in a foreign language is not very conducive to inviting your English-speaking neighbor to join the church. But it was a process of change. And so the history of Lutheran congregations in Jackson County begins with the immigration of German Lutherans into this county. But as decade after decade pass by, the ethnic ties begin to loosen. English services begin to be adopted, and the close ethnic ties then largely disappear. And so that's going to be the history that we follow. The first Lutheran congregation in Jackson County was at St. Donatus, St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church. Its first service was held on October 1st, 1854 at the home of John D. Felderman. It was led by Dr. Sigmund Fritschel, who had walked from Dubuque to St. Donatus because he had heard rumors of a Lutheran congregation meeting in the area of Tatamore Creek. We can reflect on that a little bit. A walk of 14 or 15 miles at 3 miles an hour is a commitment of 5 hours of time. And you don't know what's going to be there when you get there. And that really brings to my mind the story in Luke chapter 10, verses 1 to 12, in which Jesus sends out 72 disciples to preach and to heal. And he tells them to take nothing with them, to rely on the goodwill of the people that they minister to meet their own personal needs. Within a month of that first service, the new congregation had its own pastor, the Reverend John Dorfler. The fact that a pastor was called within a month of the first service indicates to me a substantial level of organization prior to that first service, or the presence of a dynamic leader, presumably John D. Felderman, or probably more likely both. Services were held at the Felderman home until the construction nearby of a small log church, which doubled as a school for 17 children. On April 4, 1859, the congregation adopted a constitution. Its pastor at that time was the Reverend Johann M. Schuler, who we will revisit a number of times as our story unfolds. A stone church at the site of the present church building on the hill overlooking the valley was dedicated on Palm Sunday, 1864. That church was demolished, and the existing twin-spire brick church building was started in 1919 and was dedicated on September 5, 1921. There can be differences of opinion, of course, but in my opinion, that is the most beautiful church building, not only in the county, but probably in eastern Iowa. And some publications have called it the most beautiful church building in the state of Iowa. Some might argue for the St. Donatus Catholic Church across the valley, but the combination of the two is truly spectacular. Our story then moves southeast to Andrew, where in 1862 Simeon Tebben walked to St. Donatus to ask Pastor Schuler to come to Andrew to conduct services for the Lutheran families there. Pastor Schuler came, and Salem Congregation was formed the next year in 1863. In about 1862, 7 Civil War orphans were left on Pastor Schuler's doorstep. He took them in and appealed to the Salem congregation for help. They responded by purchasing a 180-acre farm on the east edge of Andrew and building a 60-foot by 30-foot, 3-story stone building capable of accommodating up to 75 children. And this image is courtesy of Kenny and Julie Moore, who have the original framed lithograph of this. Judging from the costume of the people in front, I don't think that this was an Easterner's. I think the building seems accurate based on the description, 60 by 30, 3 stories. I'm not sure that the people in Andrew were dressed quite like that in 1864, but perhaps. The original name was the Asylum for Orphans and Destitute Children, but the 180-acre farm was rough and only 40 acres was tillable, and the orphanage struggled under debt. In 1871, the state of Iowa made a $5,000 interest-free loan without payments due until maturity in 1882. That debt was later forgiven, but in 1900, the orphanage moved to Waverly, Iowa, where it operates to this day as the Bremwood Lutheran Children's Home. It provides intensive structured residential treatment for youth ages 12 to 18 facing issues like abuse, delinquency, mental health concerns, and drug addiction. It operates under the auspices of LSI, Lutheran Services in Iowa, an affiliated ministry partner of the Iowa congregations of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA. We next travel from Andrew to Bellevue, where the German Lutherans who settled in that area were first served by itinerant preachers associated with the American Home Missionary Society. From 1864 to 1868, the families were served by Pastor Schuler from St. Donatus and Andrew. In 1868, they formed St. John's Lutheran Church, purchased 2 lots, built a church building, and called their own pastor, the Reverend J.G. Rembold. In 1873, Pastor Schuler left his Jackson County calls under a scandal, which is referred to but not identified in the 1879 history of Jackson County. Pastor Rembold in Bellevue then took over supervision of the orphanage, and I assume filled the pulpits at Salem Andrew and St. John's St. Donatus, at least for a time. There are also references to Pastor Rembold preaching at St. Marcus in Maquoketa, which is yet to come in our story. We then move on to the now closed Salem Lutheran Church, Spragueville. A Lutheran congregation in Platteville, Wisconsin had done missionary work in the area in the early 1860s. And in 1862-63, the Reverend J. Sturmer, an assistant to Pastor Schuler at St. Donatus and Andrew, had been working to establish a congregation there. Salem Spragueville was formed in 1872, and they called their first pastor the Reverend H. Geyer, G-Y-R-E. I'm not sure when Salem held its last service, but the Jackson County land records show that the church building was sold in late December 2016. From Spragueville, we travel west along what would become Highway 64 to Maquoketa. There had been mission work done in Maquoketa area through the Iowa Synod in the 1870s, and in 1877, a congregation was formed. It seems to have been more commonly referred to in town as the German Evangelical Church, but also as St. Marcus. They purchased a lot at the southwest corner of East Platte and Madison Streets. The address is 409 East Platte, now occupied by Tills Flooring, but many will recall it as an ice cream shop, and before that, the Dudes 66, Reichling Brothers, Harlan James, Phillips 66 gas station. The 1877 deed of the lot, however, is to the trustees of Salem Church of the Evangelical Association of North America at Maquoketa, so the name Lutheran wasn't even included in it. The initial name trustees were Joseph Raymond, David Ringlet, and J.J. Miller. Some histories refer to a church building and parsonage being built, but the August 9, 1877 issue of the Jackson Sentinel states, "They have purchased the frame building on East Platte Street, formerly occupied by the Midland Railroad as a depot, and cutting it in 2 pieces, have transformed the larger portion into a very respectable looking church, while the smaller is to be used as a parsonage." Another development in the trend away from German language services was the substantial anti-German prejudice which arose in the country during the First World War. An example is the following from the May 24, 1918 issue of the Excelsior Record here in town. It's entitled, "Move in the Right Direction." And it reads, "The members of the little German church on East Platte Street has made the right kind of a move and is setting a good criterion for others to follow. Hereafter, all services will be held in English entirely. Nothing in German is to be used at any time. And this speaks well for the members who are responsible for this new move. It shows that their hearts are in the right place and will have a tendency to scatter just a little more patriotic seed broadcast in this part of the country. But it's not like the German language services ended in 1918. They came back after the war was over, and the prejudice tailed off anyway. And of course, this congregation, St. Marcus, was one of the two congregations that merged in 1925 to form First Lutheran Church. And it provided the first church building and parsonage for the new congregation. So that is the first building used by First Lutheran Church from 1925, its formation, to 1939, when the new building was built in its present location. Moving ahead in time to 1890, and east of Preston, we have St. John's Lutheran Church formed, again an ethnic German church. And in 1914, St. Paul's Lutheran Church was formed in Lamont. They purchased the Methodist church building there, and thereafter built a new church building in 1919. So that's probably the oldest existing Lutheran church building in Jackson County, because it would have been faster to build that than St. Donatus was building their twin spire brick church, which wasn't finished until 21. I suspect that was finished either in 19 or 20. A side note there, during World War I, the pastor at Spragueville objected to English language services and left the call. So a little bit of conflict there. The parishioners were responding to the demand of the public to abandon German language services, and the pastor said no and left. So, since 1923, St. Paul's Lamont has shared a pastor with St. John's St. Donatus. And to bring that story up to the present, St. John's St. Donatus, St. Paul's at Lamont, and Salem at Andrew, while maintaining their separate legal status, have entered into a sharing arrangement under the name Trinity Parish of Jackson County, led by Pastor Will Layton and Deacon Lori Finn. So those three congregations, of course, have a deep, deep historical tie, and it's interesting that they have now come back together again.
Extremely successful. We love it.
So great.
It's good.
Yeah. And just as an aside here, my personal comment, I don't think that you can accuse Jackson County Lutherans of being very creative in naming their congregations. Because if you kept track, there were 3 St. John's, first at St. Donatus, then at Bellevue, then at Preston. And there were 2 Salems, first at Andrew and next at Spragueville. And then, of course, we come to the rather unoriginal and, quite frankly, uninspiring first here in Maquoketa. Anyway, so... the last Lutheran congregation in Jackson County that was formed was Calvary Lutheran Church in Sebula. It was formed in 1943, and as far as I know, it had no particular, they've moved beyond the ethnic background. As the formation in 1925 of First Lutheran was essentially, it was formed as an English language church. Although, to get that merger accomplished with St. Marcus, they did have to agree to monthly German language services, Sunday afternoons, and so on. So there was some negotiation there in that 1925 merger. Another Lutheran congregation that should be noted, as it does have a tie to First Lutheran, is Zion Lutheran Church in Nashville. A Baptist congregation was formed in Nashville in the 1870s. And they built a frame church building at the northwest corner of what's now Jackson County 98th Avenue and Jackson County 33rd Street. And at this time, there's no sign of the building. It's been demolished, and it's part of a farm field owned by Marilyn Franzen. But in 1918, that church building was sold to what I assume was a newly organized Zion Lutheran congregation in Nashville. An October 1925 Jackson Sentinel issue contained a public notice for a Sunday school rally day, which called for Sunday school at 9:30, an English language church service at 10:30 conducted by Reverend Doggs from Wyoming, and a German language service at 2:15 in the afternoon conducted by the Reverend Karen, K-E-H-R-E-N, from St. Donatus. Zion Nashville closed in July 1942 after having been served by a pastor from First Lutheran for many years. The church building was deeded to First Lutheran in August 1942, and First Lutheran sold it to Carl Franzen in February 1945. Marilyn Franzen, of course, is the widow of Harvey Franzen, who was Carl's son. Carl used the building for storage for many years, but is now long demolished. Many of its parishioners joined First Lutheran, but some joined Bethlehem Lutheran in Lost Nation, perhaps because it was closer to them, and also perhaps there was some disagreement or hard feeling arising out at the closing. And there always are in those situations. So that concludes my presentation of the history of Jackson County congregations. And so I just want to begin here, and First Lutheran has had 4 people be ordained in word and sacrament ministry. The first was Emmett Bush, pictured here both times, younger and older. And then we also have a photograph of his ordination at First Lutheran in 1958. So a very beautiful picture there. The next to be ordained was Karen Rask Baling, and she was ordained, if memory serves, I have it written down somewhere, in 1990. And then we also have a picture with her with her mother Carol, which many of you will remember. Carol was getting a master's degree at Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque at the same time Karen was a seminary student there. So after having a number of father and son combinations, Carol and Karen were the first mother-daughter students at Wartburg Seminary. Next we move on then to Judy Heinrich, from northwest of town, sister of Joe Heinrich and daughter of Marcel and Marie Heinrich. She was ordained after a career in nursing, so a later life. Teaching. Okay, teaching, music. That's right, teaching. Yeah, music teaching. Music. And the next then was Barb Jones, the daughter of John and Ruth Christensen Jones, and the brother of Jack Jones, who was mentioned earlier as a longtime organist at our church. And again, the ministry, ordained ministry, is a second career for Barb also. She was ordained at a later age. And the congregation also has a daughter who was a foreign missionary, Shirley Campbell Reentz, the daughter of Max Campbell and Althea Campbell George. She remarried after his early death. And Shirley and her husband, Jack Reentz, were longtime missionaries in New Guinea. And just as an aside, Shirley and her now late husband, Jack, were pretty much best friends with my oldest brother, Merlin Bartelt, who married Darlene Rathman from Bleedorn, the daughter, Gary Rathman's sister, who passed a couple months ago, and the daughter of Jurgen and Gladys Rathman. They were friends both from Wartburg College and Wartburg Seminary. They were there together. So, okay, now we come to sort of the plat of the acquisition of the property which First Lutheran now has. We have Platt Street at the bottom. It's oriented, south to the bottom of the picture, north, as you would expect. Eliza Street on the right, and the alley is on the left. And the upside-down L that you see was the first acquisition in 1938. That was the site of the Hand Fisher Lumberyard, which burned in 1938. And I think they continued in business, but relocated, I think, a couple blocks further east. Some here would be able to correct me if I'm wrong. And so it was an ideal site for buildings, for the building to be on the right, parking lot in the back. Next door to the west, between it and the UCC church, was the house acquired from Florence Kinley Lane, the mother of Red Lane Sr., That was acquired January 1 of 1958. That was, at that time, a rental house and 6 tourist cabins behind it, which were rented out, no longer used as a tourist cabin, but rented out for long-term rentals, sort of as standalone efficiency apartments. So that was acquired in 1958, and then the properties to the north was acquired. The house with 40 feet of frontage on Eliza Arnold and Amanda Lehan, that was purchased in 1968. Gertrude Mudd, I think, donated, if I'm not mistaken, her backyard, that's on the left, to the church in 1976. And when she passed in 1978, she gave the church an option to acquire the house. The church, there was some controversy, but the church said no, but eventually bought the house. Bought it from Mike and Jean Bellandier in the year 2003. So the Lehan house was used as a parsonage, as a second parsonage. The last pastor to live there was Pastor Bear, who left in 1976, and subsequently that was demolished. The Gert Mudd house we rented for a number of years to pay down the mortgage. We borrowed the money actually from Cliff and Carol Rask to buy the house, and we rented it out for some years to pay down that mortgage, and eventually that house then was demolished. So that is the history of the acquisition of the properties. So we can then move on to the first 4 pastors of the congregation. The first was Reverend Biederman, who, as long as I have time, will be mentioned in Carol Regenweather's Reminiscence. He was the first pastor. He was followed by the Reverend Senst, S-E-N-S-T, who my additional research has indicated to me that his wife passed away either very soon after moving here in 1927 or just before coming here in 1927. So he was very soon a widower with 3 children under 10. And the first parsonage of the congregation at 311 East Quarry Street was acquired while he was pastor, I assume because he needed the room. The little parsonage on East Platte would not have suited. He remarried in 1931, so he was the first of our, we've had 3 pastors married during the time that they were pastors here. He was the first that remarried during his pastorate. That was a very challenging time for the congregation. They had purchased a lot, looking to build a new church. They thought that East Platte Street site was not good. They bought a lot, it was expensive, they didn't have the money to build, they had to pay off the debt on the lot, they had the debt on the parsonage, and the financial situation of the congregation was in real trouble. And what really happened is that the Ladies' Aid Society, which had been formed upon the church being created, really stepped in. And they put on luncheons, and essentially they became a catering organization in Maquoketa, and they raised money, and they were able to contribute $25 a month, and really kept the congregation afloat. And of course, during the Depression, the men were doing their part too, but they were probably struggling to put food on the table. So it was up to the ladies to keep the congregation going, as would make sense. Pastor Senst left and was followed by the Reverend Kurt Weltner, or the German pronunciation, more likely Weltner. I don't know how he pronounced it. He was a bachelor when he came. He married during his pastorate here. At age 43, he married. He had been a college professor at Wartburg College in Waverly, and after leaving here, went back to being a college professor. So I don't know if, but his turn here was really summarized by saying he put the congregation's finances in order. That lot that they had purchased, he convinced the congregation to sell it, it was sold at a big loss from what they had paid for it, but they were able to take the proceeds and pay down the debt. And then he approached the church-wide organization for a loan on the parsonage, a longer-term loan on the parsonage. And so he got really the finances of the congregation in order, and really set the table for the Reverend Henry Mueller, who was a very interesting person. He apparently had begun life as a contractor. He was a builder. And so he came in 1938, and within months of his coming, the lumberyard burned down. You know, this great lot right on Platt Street, the main paved route at that time from Chicago to Des Moines, or the shortcut anyway. Only 2 blocks from Highway 61, Main Street, and so this was the ideal location. It was a big lot, room for a church building and parking. And so he convinced the congregation to buy that lot and made the plans to build. And he did the preliminary drawings, and Lincoln Jurgensen, who was an area builder, I think, from Delmer, really finalized the plans. And so the building that was built, it's a little bit hard to describe, but it was a rectangle. And they built it, I'm convinced, I haven't said this, but they built it with the north wall being a temporary wall. They built it so that they could expand the church in a cruciform shape later on without damaging the structure of the remaining church. And so that's what they did. They built a rectangle, and then so they started going. And so I think we have some photos from the early 40s. Oh, this was the first parsonage that was purchased during Pastor Sent's time. That's in the same location that the parsonage was, 311 East Quarry. That is across the street south from First Ward Park at the southeast corner of First Ward Park. And so that was the parsonage from the early 1930s to 1956. And in 1956, that church was sold. Well, I'm getting out of order, so let's go back. So, okay, so this was the parsonage in the early 40s. Here is the council from the early 40s. And I know that, obviously, because the church is built behind them. And so we have Louis Bermall, Raymond Jeanette, Henry Lassen, the Reverend Henry Mueller, John Strodoff, whose daughter, Bernadine Strodoff, married a jetter. And their homestead was the present site of the Jackson County Humane Society. That's where they lived. William Stender and Lincoln Jurgensen, the builder who was responsible for the plans. And a picture of the congregation then from the early 40s, standing at the southeast corner of the church. And the Sunday school from the early 1940s on the entrance steps. That, you know, looking at those concrete blocks there, that looks to me like maybe the church wasn't even quite finished when they took that picture. So rather than early 40s, that's maybe 1940, I suspect. And the Luther League, which well, I'll tell you.
Youth ministry.
Young people dressed classy, didn't they? As a society, we have lost something, I think. The young men in suits, and I just love those slanted hats that the young ladies are wearing. So that's the Luther League. And the Ladies' Aid Society, really you might say the salvation of the church in the prior years. And let's see, our next photo is...
This is Pastor Mueller with the Ladies' Aid. Yes?
Yeah, Pastor Mueller with the Ladies' Aid. So then we move to 1949. Pastor Mueller left in 1948, and Pastor Kumpf came and replaced him in 1948.
1947. That's fine, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, okay, and very soon, and Pastor Kumpf told me this, is that very soon after he arrived, the church council came to it and said, it's time to expand. And so what they did is they added they took down that temporary wall on the north wall, or the sort of temporary wall on the north, and they added the transepts and the chancel behind it and the bell tower to make the church into a cruciform shape, the form of a cross. So that's a model of the church building that they planned. And so construction was in 1949 and it was dedicated in 1950. And so we have here Pastor Harold Kumpf, John Strodoff, Art Moore, Ernest Schenk, and Lincoln Jurgensen. And they were the building committee. Oh, that's at the groundbreaking. And I'm not quite sure why they took a picture of a groundbreaking without the existing church in the background. But anyway, I assume that yeah, so I'm not quite sure what the vantage point of that is. But anyway, 1949. And the burning of the mortgage in 1950. So you can see here the finances of the congregation had improved dramatically. They were able to pay off the debt for a building finished in 1950. So that's the burning of the mortgage in 1950. And so they were able to pay off the debt from this addition in the very same year they dedicated it. So you could tell that the finances had improved a great deal. And so we have Lincoln Jurgensen, Art Moore, Pastor Harold Kumpf, Raymond Jeanette, Ernest Schenk, and Paul Hansen. Paul Hansen, if I have this right, would be Roger Hansen's uncle, and was a builder and was very much involved in that 1949 edition, in the building of that. And so here is a picture of the interior from the early 1950s. You can see, so the original construction would have ended right here with a wall running across that. That was the original 1939 construction. And so that wall was taken out, the transepts and the chancel and the bell tower then were added. And so the church at that time, the altar was back against the east wall under those 3 stained glass windows. The church did an extensive remodeling in 1990, 89 and 90, and the architect recommended bringing the altar out. So 3 or 4 rows of pews were removed, and the chancel area now is largely unused. It just adds some depth to the church, and so we built that out and brought the altar out closer to the congregation. I included this because I think that's just a tremendous winter photo of the church, and I don't know exactly when that was taken. Except that it had to be before 1963 because the south end of the church was added onto in 63 and 64. So a very nice winter photo. And a picture of the 1954 Sunday school picnic. That was apparently a big celebration, so you can see a lot of growth of the congregation in 10 years or 15 years from that earlier Sunday school picture to this one. So, in 1956, the old frame parsonage was sold and was moved off the lot. It wasn't demolished, it was moved. And Paul Hansen built the new parsonage at the site of the old one, 311 East Quarry Street. And so that's a picture from the 56 construction. And the next one, I think, is simply a winter scene. So it's interesting, Pastor Kumpf was the only pastor and his family, they were the only pastor, he was the only pastor who lived in that parsonage. Because by the time he retired in 1980, pastors wanted to own their own homes to build up equity. So the congregation switched to housing allowance from providing a parsonage, and the parsonage was then sold in 1984. But there's still fondness, I think, in the congregation for that house. So then we moved to 1963. And what had happened is that I mentioned the Florence Kinley Lane sold a rental house and the 6 tourist cabins in 1958. And due to a lack of Sunday school space, those buildings started to be used immediately for Sunday school, both in the house and the tourist cabins. So Sunday school classes were held in that adjoining property. But in 1963, the decision was made that to demolish those property, the buildings there, and to build an education unit to the west. And so this is a picture of the groundbreaking. Willis Burmall on the left, Pastor Harold Kumpf, Harold Wilms, William Upmeyer, and William Burmall. So,
Mrs. Willis Burmall.
I'm sorry?
I think Mrs. Willis Burmall is here, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so, yeah. We should acknowledge Marcella. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so. And so this is a picture I included. So the Florence, you can see the UCC church on the left, and the Florence, the house and the tourist cabins had been demolished, and construction is about ready to start on that 1963-64 edition. And the next one shows, so you can see up top, there's no narthex on the church. I mean, you walked in the doors and you were right in the church. And the narthex is a gathering area behind the nave, where, before you enter into the nave. And the need was felt to add a narthex. So you can see that the peak roof was extended south for the narthex to be added. The front entrance was moved to the west so that you didn't enter directly into the narthex. So there were steps up and then a hallway to the narthex, and then the education unit to the west. And okay, and so I think so this is a picture, this is part from the program of the 50th anniversary banquet 50 years ago. And so we have Pastor Robert Baer, the associate pastor at that time, Carol Regenweather, or Jim Grant, everybody remembers Jim Grant, South Inn, and then Carol Regenweather, Carol Schrader, the mother of Asher Schrader, and so hopefully we will get to that, although as I look at the clock, I'm not sure about that. Pastor Kumpf, and then Roger Wilms, who is the honorary chair of this year's 100th anniversary celebration. So, and so Pastor Kumpf's retirement after 33 years at First Lutheran in Maquoketa in 1980. And I think I would, Edna Johnson wrote a history in 1954 of the first, which is a very, very good history. I think I've pretty well covered what she has covered, but I really would like to read, in the time I have remaining, Carol Regenweather's reminiscences with a couple of additions that I would make. She entitled, this was from 1975, she wrote this in 1975, "I have seen a miracle, and this is my story. 51 years ago, that is 1924, I came to Maquoketa as a bride, so that the dates 1924-25 marks a milestone in my personal history, as well as in that of our church. My husband, Leroy Schrader, a young man of 23, had just been appointed to a position in the clerk's office at the courthouse. I had grown up a Methodist, but our family tradition was strongly in favor of a family worshiping together. My husband's home congregation had been St. John's at Preston, which was then served by Pastor Sandrock, his close friend. So we were interested in becoming part of a Lutheran congregation here. What did we find? The only organized Lutherans in Maquoketa at that time were a German Lutheran group of older people who were served by the Andrew pastor part-time. Owned a small building at the corner of East Platte and Madison, but often met in members' homes in bad weather. And there was the language barrier. I didn't understand German. So we were most happy to hear the good news later in that year, 1924. A mission church was to be organized, and our first services could be held in the basement of the First National Bank. And she adds, now Jackson State, but of course we think of it as U.S. Bank Building, and now Innovate 120. Reverend Wiederanders was usually our speaker. He was a member of the faculty at Wartburg College, Clinton, and he had been assigned by the Synod to come to Maquoketa to form this mission congregation here in Maquoketa. And of course, travel from Clinton to Maquoketa in 1925 would have been quite easy because of the because of the Lions to Anamosa train line. So I don't know if there was daily passenger service, but it would have been frequent, I think, passenger service from Clinton to Maquoketa. By February of 25, the groundwork had been laid, and the handful of members formally organized the First Lutheran Church of Maquoketa. Actually, they had the name English in there, so they formed a separate new congregation. But then, once that congregation was formed, they approached St. Marcus and discussed merger. The first church council consisted of 3 members, John F. Goldman, Herman Schenk, and my husband, Leroy Schrader. The next step in consolidating with the German congregation, and our services were transferred from the bank to their little church building, which was of the size and style of a country schoolhouse. Our music, a reed organ presided over by Carrie Broderson. On special occasions, a duet by Myrtle Jeanette and Bernadine Skrodoff, to become Jutter upon her marriage, with yours truly accompanying them on said organ. Reverend Biederman was our first pastor, and I was confirmed that fall, class of 1. I believe my husband and I felt closer to Reverend Biederman than any of our other pastors since, for we were 3 newcomers together, new in town, new to the work we were doing, and younger than the average age in our congregation. When my baby fell and cut himself in an accident, that would almost certainly be Asher, and I called his father's office, 2 anxious young men responded, for they were often together. And so, just as an aside here, Asher Schrader was born in May of 1925. First Lutheran Church was organized June 7th of 1925. So Asher Schrader would have been almost certainly the first person baptized, the first baptized member, or the, to join the church, you might say, after the initial organization. So my regret is not approaching Asher, 5 or 10 years ago and asking him to write his remembrances. And so I think that's something for all of us to remember. Don't let those opportunities pass by. She talks then about the Ladies' Aid Society, organized in the home of Martha Judson. And the Depression years, the ladies working diligently to support the projects to keep the congregation afloat. Our pastors have all been scholarly, dedicated men who each, according to his talents, helped to lay firm foundation for the growth of First Lutheran. As Carrie ten Boom says so aptly in her book, The Hiding Place, every experience God gives us, every person He puts in our lives, is the perfect preparation for the future that only He can see. She mentions Reverend Mueller, pointing out that he was a builder before studying for the ministry, and his philosophy, and she quotes him here, "You don't wait for a larger congregation to build, you build and the people will come." They ought to make a movie out of that, don't you think? And so Pastor Mueller felt that the community had great potential for growth of a Lutheran congregation. So many names in the telephone books suggested, you remember telephone books? Suggested Lutheran background. And so our beautiful building was begun in 1938. By that time, my husband had entered the practice of law and was mayor of Maquoketa. So at the groundbreaking ceremony, he was designated to turn the first spadeful of earth. And she concludes, "In my lifetime I have seen it come to pass, and that is why I say I have seen a miracle." This is Carol Regenweather, given at the 50th anniversary banquet, October 25, 1975. And of course, the other aspect there, the day in 1945 that Asher was liberated from the German POW camp was the day that her husband died of a heart attack. And she later remarried, and that accounts for the change of name from Schrader to Regenweather. So with that, I'll conclude and turn it over for closing remarks by Pastor Harrison.
Well, thank you, Cindy and Glenn, and it's a privilege and a blessing to be the 100th anniversary pastor of the congregation. I'm Neil Harrison, and it's wonderful to accompany this people of God. Speaking of that, there's a number of those folks right here in this room. Notice that we're in our 100th anniversary celebration year, and so I want to notice that there's a few people here that are a part of the Half Century or More Club in our congregation. They're rooted deeply in the life of our congregation. The patriarch of our congregation at this time, more than likely, is indeed our 100th anniversary honorary chairman, Roger Wilms. This is Roger with his wife, Audrey. Roger was born, his two parents who were here from the beginning, and he was baptized here, and so he's celebrated as our 100th anniversary honorary chairman. We also have an honorary co-chair that I want to notice, not been here, he was here for half a century as well, just about that, and we lost him the last year, Joe Bullock. He was he was the co-chair of the 100th anniversary celebration with one of the most senior members of the congregation, who's been here a couple decades more than that, Cindy Fier, who's our 100th anniversary chair. Right now, I think that it would have been that when I came here, well, what I'll say, that Galen Bartelt was our most senior patriarch, and now it's, and then it was Gary Peterson, who's Kathy Bailey's brother, and who was a matriarch of our congregation, and then Gloria Jorgensen and Marcella probably are in the same category of, Gloria is a past president of First Lutheran Church, and she is a senior matriarch as well. So that's fabulous. Some other members of our church, there's other people in this room that are a part of that half a century group. Certainly Karen Fagerland Slattery, her parents were matriarch and patriarch of our church, John and Evelyn Fagerland, you know that. And then Mark Lyon is rooted more than half a century as well in our church. And so, definitely Jerry Schwenker, the wife of the husband of Lorraine Schwenker here. So I'm thinking about, those are some of our folks. I'll use the pictures to move on. In this last few minutes, I'm just going to notice some major highlights of the First Century Mission Ministry. One of the highlights of the First Century Mission Ministry was that not only did we have two long-term pastors, which I'll notice again in a moment, which has already been referenced, but we had two women pastors of the congregation. The first was the Reverend Pamela Schrader. She served for a decade here. We just had a weekend celebrating her. And then my colleague, who was the associate here for 14 years, who was also the minister of music, she was here from until the year 2000, and her name is the Reverend Judy Heinrich. And she not only is a daughter of the congregation, who was raised up in the congregation, but she served as a pastor for 14 years as well. Then I'll say that certainly one of the, I'm going to talk about a few of the signature ministries. Before I do that, I'm going to notice once again that this is significant in the history of music in church in the United States. Very few people serve for over half a century as the organist of a congregation, and Jack Jones has been our organist now into his 53rd year, so we had a celebration of that. I think many of you know that Jack was the Boy Theater manager for 47 years as well, and so there's that. Some significant signature ministries of the congregation over the years include our Little Shepherd Preschool and Child Care Center. It's in its 41st year. Cindy and Helen Snell of the community, a former member of the congregation, they were part of a leadership group that founded that preschool ministry. We For about 20 years, we've had a community meal ministry on the last Sunday of the month, and it's been expanded by the Maquoketa Ministerial Association to be held on the second to last Sunday as well, and all the churches in the community share in that. And the church has always been it's a very generous congregation. The congregation's been very invested in the community. You heard about the Pay It Forward initiative as part of the 100th anniversary celebration. We've been a part of many things that happen in the community. Since the beginning, we partnered in the Maquoketa Community Cupboard since it started, where it was located first at the Methodist Church, as you know, and then it moved on. All the churches in the community and the larger community partners in that. A backbone of this congregation is the Ladies' Aid Society. I thought I had a picture of that. We have a major part. I think that in a future presentation we'll feature pictures of all the beautiful stained glass windows in our church. And one of the principal stained glass windows that's right there on Platt Street on the south side is a Good Shepherd window. And a backbone of this congregation is it was known originally as the Ladies' Aid Society, and then became the American Lutheran Church Women. And now, in this part of the 21st century, we call it the First Lutheran Women. And they lead a lot of the ministries in our congregation. And so that's been a primary. Certainly, if I were to think about some of the most primary highlights of the ministry in its 100 years, it had two long-term pastors. The Reverend Harold Kumpf came here in 1947, served till 1980 for 33 years. People, as I've been pastor here, I'm in my 7th year now, I hear every month, I hear somebody making reference, or 5 times a month, to Pastor Kumpf. They talk about, most often a common story is that Pastor Kumpf would come to your door, and he wasn't only a pastor at First Lutheran Church, he was a pastor to the whole community. You'd be walking down the street, and he would say, "Hello," right? And that's what he would do when he would come to your house. And when you've been pastor in that era, from when the church was really booming and growing all across the United States from 1940s, in the 50s and the 60s, he was just like a member of your family, right, when he was there that long. So he could literally, every home, he knocked on the door and he just walked in any time of day or night, no matter what was going on in your home, and he would go, "Hello," right, with his booming loud voice. And certainly he would see, he'd see a pie that was just made, or maybe chili on the stove, and he'd say, "I know," and if you're busy in another room doing whatever you're doing, taking care of your laundry or whatever it is, "Oh, I know you want me to have a cup of that chili," or a piece of that pie, and of course that's what they did, right? That's what they wanted. I was hoping that we had a picture. We didn't. I was expecting a picture of Pastor Jurdy to be here. The Reverend Gerald Jurdy served here as a successor to Pastor Kumpf as the senior pastor from 1981 to 2011. Pastor Jerry Jurdy. I wanted a photo for your purpose. The young people of the congregation, what they remember, they'll always remember the most, and we'll have that in our celebration that comes up in June. It's a major part of many of our celebration resources. But it's Pastor Jurdy on his hands and knees as a donkey on Palm Sunday. Every year on Palm Sunday, he would reenact the triumphal entry into Jerusalem of Jesus, and he would be the donkey, and then he put a child of the congregation on his back. And he and his wife were very much respected and appreciated here. Her name was Judy. She was a teacher at the high school, I think a Spanish teacher, a music leader in our church, and so
he would pick the lightest child he could find.
Our youngest 2 sons both.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Good. I think that, I'm just looking at my notes to make sure that if there's anything else that I want to notice, I think that pretty much is it. Does anybody have any questions about anything that we shared? And it's 1 o'clock, and so we want to go ahead. Arlene?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that Dennis Floyd and his wife are the ones that introduced Richard and I, from the church.
Oh, he introduced the two of you to be married, is that right?
Yeah.
And you were members of our church at one last chapter. And Dennis Boy is he's been a member since he moved to the community, so he's been a member of our church for 66 or 67 years now. And so, his wife, Nancy, and now he has his new partner, Nancy, right? So that's good. Yep. Erling, and introduced yep, that's great. Any other questions or comments about First Lutheran Church in Maquoketa? I see a number of people who are connected. We're grateful to have Mana Reichling in this chapter to be a part of our congregation. And Kathy Johnson's a member too, a long-time member. So that's good. thank you for letting us share a piece of our story with you.
Thank you.